Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Loren Richmond Jr.
All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr. Today I am welcoming, for a special episode, Martha Teutonic, and thank you so much for being here. Martha, remind for our guests, I'm forgetting your titles and positions, and share with our guests kind of just your context and what brought you here today.
Yeah, thank you, Loren. It's great to be talking with you again today. So I am an Anglican priest. I serve in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is near Niagara Falls, so right near the U.S.-Canadian border. And I serve in a fairly large for an Anglican church, downtown church that does a lot of urban ministry and outreach to those who are unhoused and facing food security problems. We last talked when my book came out called Why Gather? The Hope and Promise of the Church. And I've also authored a book called The Living Diet, which looks at our relationship with food and our bodies from a Christian perspective. So that's a little bit of a snapshot about me.
Great. Thanks, Martha. So Martha came to me. Well, I guess you didn't come to me, right? You emailed me, I think it was, and was like, what do you think about doing some kind of season recap or, summary? And I thought, what a fun idea. So this is kind of what we're doing today, and it's a little bit abnormal or outside what I normally do. So hang with us today. I'm also home with my kids. So if you hear kids in the background, please understand that. But first, kind of let me tell you, the season, so to speak, is what I'm calling season 13. And it was about 11 episodes, featured Don Weeks, a Disciples of Christ pastor in Texas, Rohadi. He's a church planter in, I forget where, but in Canada, and an author. Jack Shitama, who is a UMC pastor and camp leader in, I think it's in the East Coast, Maryland area. Mark Dorn, who's actually an evangelical author and professor at an evangelical university in my neck of the woods in Colorado. And then I talked with Josh Packard, and I'm blanking on his name. Ferguson. What was his first name?
Todd Ferguson.
Todd Ferguson, thank you. He's the author of the book Stuck, which I thought was great. After that was Andy Root. He's a professor at Luther Seminary. After that was Matt Sturdahl. He's a PCUSA pastor, again in Colorado. Talked to him about some things around rewilding Christianity and doing alternative projects, so to speak, in the midst of your traditional mainline context. Then was David Anderson Hooker. He's a consultant and does a lot of work on narrative theory, which I found his conversation really interesting. And then I had a lot of local people this season. Jessie Cruikshank, she's actually Foursquare, and I don't know where she lives exactly, but probably within like 5 miles of me. Talked about discipleship. After that was Juan Sarmiento, who's a middle jugatory leader in San Fernando area for the PCUSA. And then lastly was Eric Hoke, who's he's a former church planter in New York City, and is now doing a lot on helping pastors find bivocational or co-vocational or marketplace ministry jobs. So, Martha, let's perhaps begin with this. What stood out to you? What are the few things that stood out to you from the season?
Well, first of all, what a great lineup of leaders that you have. I think it's amazing to collect that diversity of voices and contexts in your podcast. The reason why I reached out to you is because after coming on your podcast, I subscribed to the podcast, and I've just been really, really impressed by the conversation that you've been having, the synergies that I hear across those conversations, and just how important it is to have like this safe space to talk about these real things from a variety of perspectives. So, I mean, that's kind of the broad brushstrokes of what stuck out to me is just how important this conversation is and this platform is. But within that, and you said it in your introduction, the Ferguson and Packard books stuck, and the interview that you had with them, it really ended up kind of framing everything else that I was hearing in the season. And I can't even begin to tell you like how many times I've quoted them in conversations with fellow leaders. I immediately bought the book, and I have all kinds of pages folded over in it.
Yeah.
And there were just so many things that I've never heard so clearly articulated before that I found absolutely liberating as a mainline Christian leader. And so then that kind of became the lens through which I heard a lot of the other conversations. I think that their naming of the big systems that are at the heart of not only the decline of the mainline church, but why clergy are struggling so much in their ministries, why clergy burnout is such a big thing. I think that we just have such a tendency to talk about mainline decline and clergy burnout as if they're problems that individual people and congregations can solve.
Right.
And to have that broadened out into a systemic conversation, and to say like it has to be a systemic conversation. We have to be having this conversation on a collective scale. I just thought was so important to say. And I realized, as I listened to them and as I considered the season as a whole, I think I'm just less and less inclined toward conversations that seem to suggest that that there are avenues that can be taken for individual leaders and congregations to flourish. And I, I'm in a congregation that in many ways is flourishing. But
flesh that out. What do you mean by that? Avenues, less and less avenues, if I'm hearing
I guess I'm just less interested in conversations about how individual leaders and individual congregations can flourish. And I'm really committed to that bigger conversation that we need to be having about institutional realities and institutional well-being. And, Packard and Ferguson really kind of named the truth that like so much of our holding up of leaders who are doing really well is within that framework of secularism and capitalism that isn't all that life-giving, right? So unless we're kind of having that bigger conversation, I think that there's just something kind of false about talking about how anybody just on their own is doing well.
That's where I'm thinking about Andy Root. And I guess some of this, I think maybe what's coming to mind is coming from this book I just read of his, because I think I had him on for Churches in the Crisis of Innovation. I'm hoping to get him on for churches in the crisis of decline. But certainly in churches in the, if I'm getting the title right, in the crisis of innovation, he does in that book really take an examination of our, like you mentioned there, of our like management business type focus of like, just being super efficient and super, super, management focused, efficiency focused, it's going to like solve our problems. And I think if I'm hearing you right, what I'm hearing from you is like this idea that like these things that we think are going to solve our problems are really kind of just like hauling us out, like killing our souls, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, Andy Root would like probably need to be held in tension with Matt Sertle. Is that who you pronounce his last name?
Yeah.
Like, because, and I think Andy Root says this in his interview with you. Like, it's not that innovation and passion projects can't be good, because they can.
Right.
Like, he's not anti change or like anti creativity. But when it's just sort of this endless pressure to do the next big thing, to kind of be ahead of the curve, to anticipate the next magic bullet, or to be able to promote a magic bullet. Yeah, there's just kind of an endless spiral of pressure that I think, whether we're in the mainline church or whether we're in more charismatic traditions, we can feel that pressure enormously.
Yeah.
And I think that struck me too. Like, I appreciated in the season the diversity of voices. I don't know what it's like to lead anything like a mega church or a church in that more charismatic tradition. I'm like mainline through and through. In the book Stuck, the pressures that mainline leaders feel to save the declining church are contrasted with the pressures that those in the more evangelical or charismatic side of things feel to perform. But across all of the traditions, I think that clergy feel like it's all riding on us.
Yeah.
And it can be so personality focused, no matter what tradition you're coming from, which I think is, again, a symptom of kind of that capitalistic model that seeps into how we view what church success looks like, how we view what pastoral success looks like. And it creates idols and scapegoats of our Christian leaders.
Let me ask you something here. I'm going to jump in if I may.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, again, we live in an influencer culture where, credibility and relevance comes not through, earned status like degrees or experience, but it comes through popularity online, like through how many TikTok followers you have, or, Twitter followers, or name you. So hopefully this isn't throwing somebody under the bus, but I'm thinking about Convergence, their US-based kind of mainline progressive church consulting group based out of Georgia, I think. I've had their leader, Cameron Trimble, I think is her name, on the pod. But it's just coming to mind because they recently launched like a digital ministry kind of cohort, or I'm not sure if that's the exact name, but some kind of digital ministry like leaders group, basically. So, they brought on some young folks who seem to be getting some great traction in quote unquote digital ministry, whatever that means. And it's primarily like, people who have a lot of followers on TikTok because they're good at making these like short TikTok videos. And I'm a little weary, perhaps, and maybe that's just like me, old man here, right? But I feel like that sort of feeds into what you're talking about there. This like, oh, if I'm going to be a good pastor, if I'm going to get people, like I've got to up my Instagram game, or I've got to improve my TikTok video skills. And that, to me, it just feels like we're missing the point. I don't know. How does that come across to you?
Yeah, I really relate to what you're saying. And at the same time, there's another dimension to that whole conundrum. Like my kids are teenagers, and my kids want our church to be on TikTok. And the reason why they want the church to be on TikTok is really, really simple. It's because they see their peers.
Yeah, they're on TikTok.
Well, yeah, that's where that's where conversation is happening. But even more fundamentally, like they see that their peers have this like terrible view of what the church is about, that the church is misogynist, racist, homophobic, like you name it, right? And they really think that we need to be speaking into that space and into that generation with a positive message of what religion can be, who God is. So like I really like I totally want to opt out of the influencer culture. I really, really do. And at the same time, like there is a message here that we do believe is worth sharing. And so how do we hold those things in balance?
Well, I think, this is certainly something I've tried to highlight recently, just in my own context, or live into, is this tension and nuance and complexity that I don't think we're great at least in American culture or societally, at living into, because, as we're recording this in my world, it just feels like everything is all wrong or it's all good. And there's no way to like be like, well, yes, and, or no, and, or but, or what have you.
Yeah. Yeah. And, as you say that, I'm kind of like struck by David Anderson Hooker's episode with you. And, his vision of a church that is so much more interested in the questions than the answers. And that narrative of compassion, compassion and care for the community around us. Like, I think that at the heart of, what we're talking about, and what you're talking about across this podcast is like a great big why question. Like, why does this matter? Like, I listened to that episode and like, yeah, that's the church I want to be part of. That's the church I try to lead. I'm not sure it's the church that is the most popular. I'm not sure that it's the church that is gonna like solve the problem of decline. I'm not sure that it's the church that is going to fill our pews with Gen Zers. But like, I think it is the faithful church. Like, I think that's the church that we're called to be. I think that it's just like wildly important to hold that space for more questions than answers, for the complexities, for the not either or, but both and how we hold things in chin. Like, I'm really committed to that church, whether or not it's, gonna be successful in the traditional metrics. Like, that's the church I want to be part of.
I mean, this is kind of where it all kind of fits together, if I can think big picture here, because like, and again, for folks who haven't listened to, go back and listen to that David Anderson Hooker episode again. And if I'm remembering, Martha, he kind of talked about like talking about as a church, like a church that like really cared for one another, and say, this is a church where we care for one another. And how can we extend that care to our community, right?
Yeah.
So if we're doing that kind of work, like we're not going to be like on a church growth, again, not to diminish or dismiss all folks who are really focused on church growth. I think there can be spaces and contexts where that's appropriate. But if we're really like, what we value is, caring for our community and caring for one another, like that's going to be a slow path, right? And with that is going to come like external pressures from perhaps the denomination being like, hey, we need to see more. We need to see more people in the pews. It's also going to come with financial challenges because there's not going to be a huge budget to pay your bills. And then like you're not going to get any like huge influencer status because it's like, oh, great, you've got like 30, 40, 50 people, if that, on a Sunday, like congratulations. And it's hard to like quantify the real effect and impact you may be, or your church may be having on the community, right?
Yeah. So I have like a few follow-up thoughts about that because like that church exists, like that
Right.
church of care and compassion, not just for the people in that community, but how that care and compassion then it extends outwards into the life of the wider community. I mean, I live that church. I see that church. That church is happening in amazing ways all over the place. That is a narrative that we need to be a lot clearer about sharing and naming. And like, if that's the narrative that we're claiming for ourselves, then that is so connected to the conversation around kind of the great big systemic changes that are named in that book, Stuck, that we have to get real about. Because, and this is I'm not sure it came up in this season. It might have been in the last season, but there was a question that one of your interviewees raised that has just absolutely been echoing in my mind since. And it's the question about our wealth. So there is tremendous wealth in the mainline church. There isn't tremendous wealth in like many individual congregations right now in the mainline church. I mean, most mainline churches that I know are struggling for resources in one way or another. But I think that if we could be like super clear about our narrative, about why that matters, about why that's an offering, not just for the people who are like in it, but how that does extend outwards, and it does in like some really, really powerful ways, then I think that we can, like, we're not without resources to line up and equip that narrative, that reality. Like, I don't think that struggle and decline has to be the only reality that we're facing right now. Like, we also are facing a reality of like, what are we going to do with our wealth and why?
Right.
And I don't think that we talk about that at all.
Do you think practically speaking, institutions or denominations or, judicatories are just going to have to like, and maybe you're thinking of this differently, but I'm thinking this way, are just going to have to make a conscious decision to continually invest in churches and ministries that may be quote unquote losing money because they're doing good ministry? Like, is that drive for like sustainability and viability, is that overrated, do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I think that if I look at the Anglican Church in Niagara, I think that we need to do just a basic audit of our resources and decide where we want to put them and why. And, some of those resources might go into congregations that look like they're doing well in kind of more traditional ways. But yeah, some of them might go into ministries that just like are really, really vital for the community and that like really represent what we want to be about, but aren't, don't have the traditional metrics associated with them. Like, I think that, I don't think it has to be one or the other, but I think that it needs to be like an honest conversation. And again, I think it needs to be if I go back to David Anderson Hooker, I think that we need to be really clear about the narrative.
Right. Yeah. Cause this is, I think, I don't know if this came up with my conversation with Jesse Cruikshank, but it feels like something related to, cause you mentioned Gen Z, and Gen Z is certainly like, the earth's on fire. Like, what's the point of saving for tomorrow? Like, let's throw all available resources into saving the planet, which, I'm not a climate scientist, but I might be like, well, I'm not sure. Like, it's that, I don't know I guess what I'm saying, like, wisdom, perhaps, as someone who's older, might offer some restraint. But that being said, like, we can understand that mindset of like, hey, there's things that have to be taken care of like today. We don't have time to worry about tomorrow. Yet also perhaps the Christian, I don't know. There is some wisdom in like thinking long term, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So there is that tension, I guess, and balance we might need to think about again in church context of like, hey, we don't necessarily want to throw it all in one project here, but also like, hey, the church is in crisis in many ways, right?
Yeah. And, gosh, I had a conversation with my daughter recently that made me sort of question how much we can really even predict the future. I mean, her like pretty staunch take on things is that like the traditional mainline church with all of its beautiful architecture and ritual and so on and so forth, like that is like what is old is going to be new again, and like that the tide is going to turn, and that's going to be the hip new thing. Like,
I hope so, right?
Yeah, like she's 16 and she's convinced that this is where the tide is going. And who knows? But like, there is something very risky in divesting ourselves of a bunch of properties that might turn out to be like kind of the next big thing in another couple of years. But again, like predicting the future, we're not so good at as Christians, but we have tons of like resources for discernment and where God is leading us right now.
Yeah. I love that. Thanks for mentioning that, the importance of prayer and discernment when navigating the future.
Yeah. I think that conversation with Jesse Cruikshank, to me, was also very connected to the David Anderson Hooker conversation around narrative. And obviously she comes at it from quite a different perspective.
Right.
And I love that, like brain science, as like a way of thinking about discipleship. But again, like the brain seeks identity. Like, who are we? Like, I hear a narrative question there. And I think being really clear about who we are and like who God has called us to be, I think is going to be fundamental in those discernment conversations and in that prayer.
Well, let's flip the mic here, and why don't you pepper me with a few questions, and we'll take it a different direction here.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I told you what stuck out to me about the season. What's been sticking in your mind the most from the conversations you've been having?
I mean, certainly, I think the Ferguson and Packard book stuck out to me. I'm hoping to explore this more in another podcast, but I've kind of took it to heart so much that I've actually become co-vocational or bi-vocational myself, taking on a new role in a social work type job while retaining a lesser time position at my church. Um, I really, really, really resonated with Jesse Cruikshank's episode because I think for me, like I grew up very independent, like fundamental Baptist, independent Baptist, where it was really about her two things of behavior. And now I'm forgetting the other one. Behavior and I don't know if it was, right. I think it was right behavior, right beliefs. If were
Right.
her kind of two false markers. And this is me speaking, but I get, I don't know, like triggers is too strong a word, I feel like, but I feel like, man, I see those similar things right now at least in my context of like progressive Christianity, where it's like, it's all about like right behavior and right belief.
Mm.
And like, that makes me nervous. And then, I really liked David Anderson Hooker's things about narrative. And I've been thinking about like his metaphor of like narrative as like the highways, as like the highways. Cause I think we've all probably, at least anyone who's been around church or been a leader in church for long enough, you can just see like how anything, even good news or bad news, sort of gets filtered in. Like it gets filtered through this like this pathway, this roadway that the congregation is essentially just trained to think. Like this is a silly example, but I think it makes sense. So I'm here in Denver, Colorado Metro, and like the Denver Nuggets NBA basketball team just won an NBA championship. So the city's all really excited. And for years, it was always like they'd do this. I mean, obviously not pre-social media, but kind of trends backward. But it was like hashtag Nug Life, meaning like, oh, the Nuggets just always lose. They always fall up short. Like similar like the Boston Red Sox for my
Right.
East Coast baseball fans, like they'd always fall up short. So
The
it was like
Maple
whenever
Leafs too.
things, right. So whenever, like the Leafs, yeah, the Maple Leafs. My goodness, you Toronto fans are long suffering there.
Totally.
So like now that the Nuggets finally broke through and won, like that narrative of like, oh, Nug Life, we just always fall short or get screwed. Like that narrative is completely blown up. But prior to this season, like anything happened, it was just like filtered through that like Nug Life. Oh, that's what happens to us. Like we get bad calls from the officials, or we have a bad break and a person gets injured, and I can really see that in churches of like, oh man, of course everybody's going to the church down the street, the new church down the street. That's just what happens to us. Or, oh, of course our roof is leaking. Like that's just what happens to us. Like these narratives just kind of like frame how we interpret everything.
Yeah.
And the examination and trying to rework those narratives, I think, is so important. How can we create healthier narratives for ourselves and our communities and our churches?
Yeah. I liked his question, like, what if we focused on the good?
Mm-hmm.
It's like just such a simple way
Mm-hmm.
of phrasing it.
Yeah. Because I'd say, like, if your church or, denominational body or whatever is wanting to do some consulting, like, it really was fascinating when I was in the room with him. Just that shift. I mean, that's simple, but I thought it was a significant shift of, like, what is happening good here that we can focus on?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so easy to be like, here's all the bad stuff that we need to, and I think to some extent, like that bad stuff just becomes overwhelming. It just becomes soul sucking. But there's so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. And I didn't hear any sort of Pollyanna in
Mm-hmm.
what Hooker
Right.
was saying. Like it wasn't, oh, just look on the bright side. 'Cause like that isn't helpful. It's not
Mm-hmm.
helpful when you're feeling like you're struggling to just be told, well, look on the bright side. But that's not like what he had to say was a lot more nuanced than that. It
Right.
was like, where are we going to put our energy?
Right.
Right. Like, what are we going to allow to dictate our energy?
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's like an honest way of framing the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a few follow-up questions for
Yeah.
you in terms of what stuck out for you and what stuck out for me in the season. But first of all, I'd like to just zero in for a second on the bivocational piece, because that I would say that was one of the things that was again named in the book Stuck is I think at least one of the examples of clergy burnout was somebody who was trying to work a job to pay the bills while also leading a church, and just like how impossible that was. But then when I listened to the episode with Eric Hoke, I think he really put the nuts and bolts together in terms of what needs to happen to make bivocational possible.
Right.
And he was pretty clear about like the expectations on a pastor really need to change if we're going to get serious about bivocational. And that's a part of the conversation I just haven't heard. Like we've been talking about, I've been ordained for almost 20 years, and like bivocational has been a conversation for all of those 20 years. But not in any sort of nuts and bolts sort of way in terms of like, okay, how are we going to adjust expectations so that people could actually work 2 jobs? And I'm just wondering how you're navigating that, like that shifting of expectations that has got to be at the heart of taking that leap in bivocational.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, I've only been at this like a month officially, and there's a lot I'm noticing. For one, being a social worker, I'm essentially a social worker, sort of in that context. And one thing I'm noticing immediately, like, I have a high compassion need job, and it's very contrasting. Like the church I work at is in a very high income area in social economic context, and I'm working with very low socioeconomic context. So, for me at least, I'm glad that I have that contrast, because I don't know if I could be like, have to be super compassionate Loren Monday through Friday and then go be super compassionate Loren like Sunday and weeknights. For instance, I think my compassion well would just run out, at least with kids at home too, right? I think another reality is, like I'm an associate, so there's not like the whole thing's not riding on me, so to speak, as like a senior pastor or lead pastor might have, and hopefully I'm hoping that I have some measure of concern for my senior pastor, but ultimately I'm trying to tell myself like, that's not my, I can't control that. I need to focus on my stuff, and, they have to worry about their own stuff, I guess. And I think there is some level of like, is this sustainable? Certainly. I don't know. I guess time will tell. But at least in my context, like I look at like the median cost of a house is just ridiculous. And I think one of the things that I really realized is like, there just wasn't a viable path to make what I feel like I need to make to support my family in this context in a church setting. And then going back to all the things we talked about, like among church decline, like it's not looking too promising. But I mean, you mentioned being ordained for 20 years. Like I'm thinking like I need to still get another 20 years out of my career. So those are kind of what has been my current realities. And I think, I have an episode several seasons back with Jeff McDonald, who's the UCC pastor out of Massachusetts, who's written a book on bivocationality, which I really recommend. We talk a lot of practicalities in there. There certainly are some real, challenges. Still, I mean, I think student loans for one is like a huge, then in the States, everybody's, and who knows, knock on wood, what's going to happen here with the Supreme Court as recording this. But those are, I mean, this is where I want to have like a seminary president, on the pod and be like, how do you justify, I mean, I think I've asked this too, in some ways, as much as I love seminary, like, how do you justify a student taking on, close to 6 figures in debt.
Yeah.
It's just tough. So that's kind of how I've been navigating it so far.
Well, in lots of ways, you're a good case study. Like, I hope
Right.
that you'll um, share your experience as you go, because I think that those are all the dynamics that need to be worked out and talked about in a pretty honest way. Like,
Mm-hmm.
as we're kind of navigating these new waters. Um, I'm interested. So, in my context, I think that um, I think that we can get into a lot of magical thinking
Mm-hmm.
about what's going to save the church,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that there is a reluctance to talk honestly about our struggles.
Hmm.
Um, I, in my book, well, I gather I do talk about my own um, coming pretty close to burnout at
Mm-hmm.
one particular point. And as I've kind of toured around and shared stuff from my book and various speaking engagements, um, I hear a lot of clergy who are just like really grateful that
Right.
I'm willing to name that, because it's hard to talk about. Like, it's hard to talk about any sort of failure or
Mm-hmm.
struggle. Um, I reached out to you about doing the podcast today because I don't hear the conversations that you're having happening in a lot of places, like with this level of honesty and also, like, not just honesty, but bringing a lot of different fields of expertise into the conversation. So, like, what allows you to do this podcast? Like, what allows you to create this space for these conversations? Like, is this a fairly independent initiative?
Yeah, thanks for that. It sort of started as a COVID project back in 2020, right? When I was leading a new church start, and it's sort of just grown and morphed into there. And I found kind of different ways to kind of make it sustainable. Like I have a little LLC that I kind of use to do other podcasts for people, kind of help cover some of my own podcasting expenses. And I think for me, I'm just a very curious person. Like I did CPE or clinical pastoral education for folks familiar with it a year ago, right? And one of my colleagues was like, "Oh, Loren, curiosity is your superpower." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, what a fun superpower!"
You should put that on a mug.
Right. So I'm a very curious person. I think, again, with my context, having grown up very conservative, you know, uh, I remember like being told in Bible college, like, "Oh, don't read that author." Like that's all, just completely toss away anything. So, there's some people I'm not going to have on the pod. Like, I'm not going to have like Preston Sprinkle, for instance, is someone who is a name who seems like kind of like be a centerish figure, but I'm not going to have him on because I don't want to risk harming LGBT plus persons.
Yeah.
That being said, there's people I've had on the pod who I know, or I shouldn't say I know, but I strongly would bet who are not LGBT affirming, who I might disagree with on other topics, theological perspectives. But I think it comes down to like I'm a very curious person. So I think I think that there's always people who have some value and insights that I can learn from, and I've been decent at like kind of filtering out what I can take and disregard and get rid of the rest. I think I feel like I have to name something that coming up within me here. You kind of mentioned like the realities of like what magical thinking, and I think that's also something that kind of I wanted to just like name as like I'm all for being positive and forward thinking and optimistic, but I do think there's this level of like magical thinking that happens like I've heard it like of like, oh, let's just celebrate abundance and talk about abundance and all this abundance. And I get it. Like it really does make a difference when we think about, to have the narrative of like, there's enough, like that's a narrative versus like always coming short. But also I think for me at least, and I hear this a little bit from you and what you share, like, I think there's this reality of like, if I'm constantly like coming up short and just constantly stretching, hustling to pay the bills or whatever, like that's a reality that to have that like not affirmed is really discouraging when you're like, boy, it's really hard to not have that affirmed or seen, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I think, again, if folks have been listening to me for quite a while, I think I have an episode, I forget when this airs, but where my producer Paul interviews me, just kind of talking about it, the church start that I was leading and how that ended. I changed my Twitter handle, the failed church planner, because I just wanted to, like, that was the narrative that was going on, I imagined. And I just wanted to like lean into it and be like, hey, I'm not going to try to ignore it. Like, this is reality. Like, I'm perceived as a failed church planter. And, broadly speaking, like, I think there's some element of damaged goods, so to speak, among my profile in, middle adjudicatory offices. And it is what it is. I can't, it is what it is. So I think just naming those things, I think is important, and not trying to sugarcoat them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like a couple of things that I would say in response to that, again, in appreciation of what you're doing here. The first is validation. And like that is the key word in our household right now. And it's kind of the key mental health buzzword, validation. But like you really can't get anywhere in terms of health and well-being, or like helping someone on the path of health and well-being, unless you're willing to start with validation, like validate the actual experience.
Right.
And there's a lot of curiosity and validation as well, because one of the key questions of validation is like, help me to understand why. Like, help me to understand why you're feeling this way. Help me to understand your experience. It's not just like kind of a blanket, yeah, like that totally makes sense. I feel like that too. No, it's like the probing questions of like, help me to understand. And then I think the other piece that I just think is so important, and I think has been like kind of a thread through our conversation today, like when you talk about abundance, like lean into abundance, but you're talking to people who are hungry, like who like, we serve breakfast to 100+ people a day here at our church, and every day, and like they don't want to hear me say like just lean into your abundance, like that. Like if you want to change the narrative, it has to be a communal question. It has to be a collective question. Like it can't just be sort of put on the individual to, well, just look at the bright side, just count your blessings. Like we need to make some different decisions together about what we have and what we're doing with it. So I guess a follow-up question I would have for you in all of this is like, and I don't necessarily expect you to know the answer to this, but like, how can we get these conversations happening more widely? How can we take what you're doing here and put the blowhorn on it?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your support. I mean, I feel like the cliche like podcaster is response is like and share, subscribe and review and share. But I mean, I think, you know, I guess like I'm someone who like deeply loves and cares about and believes in the church. Like I have a high ecclesiology, to use that word. Like I really believe that the gathered body of Christ, like good stuff, happens when we're gathered together. I'm 100% aware of like the real challenges that come with church. Like I've lived those experiences. Like I could tell you story to story about like ways that I've been screwed over by the church. So I'm not like Pollyannish about like the church, and that, again, Matt will think like, oh, let's just get people together that'll solve the world's problems. But I believe in the church. I have a high, like I said, high ecclesiology. So I'm hopeful that like, I'm hoping to encourage people that like, what we do matters as pastors. There is hope for the church. Like, let's look forward, believing that things are possible, with God's help. I don't know. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I'm with you. I have a huge love for the church, and not just love for the church, but I really think it matters.
Mm-hmm.
I really think that what we are doing at its best can be transformational, not just for us, but for the world around us. And I think it just like critically matters. So yeah, I'm with you in persevering in those conversations and that curiosity.
Awesome.
So I thought it might be fun to turn the tables once again and and give you a chance to answer the questions that you always close out your podcasts with your guests.
Yeah.
So are you okay with
let's do
tables?
Let's do it.
Okay. So if you could meet a Christian leader, dead or alive, who would you want to meet and why?
I think what immediately comes to mind, and this is because, for some reason, I'm not going to say Andy Root, but Andy Root's books have really been resonating with me in a way that have not resonated with me since I first read Marcus Borg's Heart of Christianity. I was introduced to Marcus Borg when I was going through a time of deep kind of soul searching and deconstruction by Disciples of Christ pastor. And so, I mean, I really appreciate, I feel like in Marcus Borg's Heart of Christianity saved my faith. So I think I would have to want to meet with him. Eugene Peterson is another person that comes in mind. Those are two that come to mind, I think, immediately.
Oh, those are great answers. If you could be Pope for a day, what would that day look like?
Yeah. I mean, I think folks often aren't sure what to do with this question. And I really mean it to be like, I think we often say, well, if I was king for a day, if I ruled the world for a day, like that's what it's meant to, except like in a church Christian context. I mean, practically speaking, I know this is a cliche answer, but I'd love to like explore Vatican City. Like I'm a church nerd, so I would totally want to just have all access to Vatican City. That being said, like on a more like pontifical, so to speak, if I could decree this, I think I'd really be like, folks, let's just, I don't know. This is where I struggle, perhaps, Martha, is like today I'm going to write I'm going to write an email of encouragement to like a fundamental Baptist pastor who's the pastor of the church that I grew up going to, where my in-laws still go to. And my kids just went to VBS last week. And I'm going to tell them, like, I disagree with you on a whole host of theological issues, but I can tell that you're trying to faithfully follow, like, that you're trying to be faithful and lead your church. And, like, I wish that we could have a more of that attitude, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that would be a pretty wonderful thing. What do you think history will remember about this time that we're in right now?
I've been thinking about pendulums. Like around 2020, obviously, we swung pretty far left. And now it's like we're swinging even further right. Like, I don't know what's like in Canada, but man, in the States, it's just like everybody is just going bonkersville, it seems like, to the right, on a whole host of things that just like, folks, can we chill out and settle down? And I don't know, like, I'm not really old enough, I suppose, to have a further view of history, but I sort of wonder, like, these pendulum swings, like, are we going to remember like these giant pendulum swings? And maybe not the pendulum swings itself, but sort of the rapidness, right? Because we're thinking like within 3 years, just this huge, I thought like an appropriate swing to the left when it came to issues of Black Lives Matters and things like that. But then like now it just complete an opposite and further swing to the right. So I wondered, like, the speed and extremeness of these swings. I wonder if that will be remembered.
Yeah. I mean, I think polarized is the word that comes to mind.
Right.
It just seems that that we just keep swinging between which side of the pole gets to have the loudest voice for a time. Yeah. Okay, and the last question, what are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
I mean, I really, like I said earlier, I really believe in the church. My senior pastor, I'll give a shout out to Sandy Dillon at a Wash Park UMC. She gave a message just yesterday, actually, as we're recording this, and she was talking about she's preaching from Acts 3, the Peter and John, silver and gold have I none. Again, I'm quoting it from King James. That's how I remember it. Silver and gold have I none, but this is what I do have. In the name of Jesus, rise up and walk. To the man with mobility issues, and she said something to the effect like it's better in here, like it's better without walls, and that's what really drew me, I think, to this kind of strain of Christianity that I'm in, like this more inclusive, loving, gracious Christianity from my youth, fundamental, Baptist world. Like, that's what I believe. Like, I believe God is a God of grace and love, and I think, like, I hope that Christianity continues to be, and more so, a faith that's like, it's better in here. Like, this is a better way of doing life, together.
Yeah. I think that's the transformational piece that I want to see too, and that I really believe in. I really appreciate this conversation today.
Yeah. Well, let's leave each other with a word of peace then. How about that?
That sounds great.
May God's peace be with you, Martha.
And also with you, Loren.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Loren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.